So that is my reading for tonight. So
Thank
you very
you,
much.
Brad. Thank you for that wonderful reading and for sharing. You might perhaps share a little bit more a little later on. We'll see how
Sure.
we go.
Yeah.
We'll see how we go. But there's so many there are so many points of entry and places to begin, and I'm being indecisive. I'm uncertain where to start, but I had one idea, and then as you were reading, I was struck again. It's something I was struck by a long time ago with this book, but that these women are it's a weird subculture, right? The world of the contract aid workers who are very international and cosmopolitan, and also whose lives are very broken up. But these contracts are short, and it's something that came up in the reading. That they don't know where they'll be next year, and they don't know. And one of the questions that it seems as though Tess is asking herself in the course of this novel, as she's watching her friend, whose life is changing or has already changed irrevocably. I mean, a child is incompatible with the life that they have led and the life that Tess will still lead. But Tess keeps asking, why did she? I mean, I think it's from the passage just before where you were reading towards the end. Did she even know why Laura first set off? Why they did it, thinking they would find something in someone else's pain, or that the pain of others would overwhelm their own, or a simple thirst for adventure. So I wondered if you might talk a little about who these people are and where they're coming from, and whether in your mind there's a difference for Tess and for Laura in what these years abroad have meant.
Oh man, well, so yeah, that's a lot to say. Definitely, it's a subculture would be one way to put it, but it's even internally incoherent, exactly because of there's so many different reasons that people end up in this situation. So before we talking about kind of other people that would come in and out of the world, just between these two characters, where Laura is a woman from New York City, her father's Mexican, her mother's American, her life has already been international polyglot since she was a kid. So and then her experience as an aid worker was also much more diverse. She was all over, she was in several countries in Africa before she came to the Balkans. So she arrived in the Balkans as a kind of seasoned aid worker that had already been around, although as they realize at some point when they start to think back on this, they're also like 25-year-old kids,
Right.
Who are in these insane situations. Whereas Tess is a woman from Kansas City, from the heartland, from a single mom who, in many ways was isolated, landlocked in the middle of Kansas, the middle of the U.S., as far from a border as was possible. And so for her to kind of go into this life has a different resonance in some way. And then as they're going through these scenes, you get these kinds of people that, like the car thief that she's talking about in Bosnia at some point, like these logisticians who are kind of like at the edge of a military contractor kind of a world. They're just hustling. There's absolutely no idea that there's a kind of moral impetus in any of this work. It's purely just like getting by, doing what you can, surviving. Whereas people like Tess and Laura come into it thinking that they were going to do meaningful work, and then had to be schooled out of that. And so then had to decide what meaning was once that had been made impossible by the realities that they were in, confronted with the neocolonialism of the situation. And so there's a different thing that has to adjust in their worldviews once there's no longer an idea that helping people is a meaningful thing in this structure,
Right. And there's also, I mean, and he's not in the hospital. Barish is in the hospital, but Max, who's Tess's half brother, is not in the hospital, but he's somebody who's shared a certain amount of the time in these countries. He's been in a lot of these places with them or alongside them, and yet he's looking for something quite different, it seems.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's, the object of a bit of sarcasm in this book, I believe. But yeah, so her half brother is a bit of like, if Tess is marginal, he's even much more marginal. Who is he ends up in a monastery in Syria, wandering around alone in the mountains, kind of thinking that he'll find something in absolute dropout. So in a much kind of, he in some ways like a much more lost person than Tess, or certainly than Laura. So yeah, and Laura in some ways seems less tormented by some of these questions than Tess is.
And Tess is, right.
Yeah, and I think Max is beyond tormented, is kind of is really gone off as far as he can to the margins.
Right, but I mean, I think for me, it's a spectrum, or in reading the novel. I mean, it's a much broader discussion that we don't have to have now. But I think one of the things that when we think of our nation of Americans as often somewhat hermetic, because the United States is so big and so broad that people don't necessarily look beyond the borders of the nation, and don't learn foreign languages, and don't go overseas and so on. And this is sort of the opposite of that. This is a group of people whose instinct to move, a restlessness to move and to experience is pretty radical, and indeed it's stopping that. It's true what the Tess has this musing that she's learned that the navel of the world will occur around you wherever you are, but she isn't settled. I mean, it isn't as though she's stopped moving. Whereas Laura, who came home, Laura has moved back to the United States and started a different phase of her life.
Yeah. Okay, there's a bunch of things to talk about in what you just said, but so in terms of the looking outward, looking inward thing, so one of the experiences that I passed through that inevitably kind of was in the background of writing this book was I had left the US and I had lived abroad for 15 years, and I moved back in September of 2011. And so, which happened to be the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, I moved to New York. And so I remember these literary events and things happening where the whole discussion was about the American experience of those 10 years. The only international thing that was acknowledged was some relationship to kind of the veterans experience, but there was no awareness of what the US's response to 9/11 had done to the rest of the world, and how huge of an impact it had been. And it reminded me when I first moved to the Balkans in the mid-90s, and understanding what foreign policy looked like on the ground. And it was such a huge awakening to me, who had hardly ever been abroad before. And so there was something where you understand that for the rest of the world, foreign policy is what's happening, and it's different exactly right now. There's an epochal shift is happening, but certainly from the last 20, 30, 100 years, U.S. foreign policy was so hugely determined.
Yeah, since World War II, for sure.
Yeah, let's say, definitely. And so,
World War I, too.
But so I wanted in some way to, or not that I wanted to, but I would inevitably, because it was my experience, kind of wrestle with that reality. So that's one thing that you said. And then, yeah, about right. I mean, Laura moved back, her mother was ill. She moved back so she's already kind of dropped out of the life. Tess and Laura were working together in Istanbul when Laura's mother got ill, and she was like, okay, I'm moving back to New York and taking care of my mom. And during that period, she got pregnant, and this whole thing started, which she seems to be accepting. But to Tess, it was a huge tragedy. She lost her best friend. There's no home for her to go back to. And so she's caught in a way thinking like, who am I? Part of what she's doing, watching her friend give birth, is wonder who she is and what she has and what she belongs to and where she could possibly make sense. So yeah.
I was struck on rereading. So for those of you who haven't yet had the joy of reading this novel, and I can't tell you how highly I recommend it. And by the way, if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A at any time. So you can, if a question occurs to you, feel free to type it in now. We'll come to the questions later. But when I was rereading it, so for those of you who haven't read it, Tess they're no longer together, but she's had a boyfriend who is of Lebanese extraction, raised in Mexico. He is a spiritual, he and her half brother Max have a spiritual connection, but he is learning from a Muslim convert named Nasruddin in Cairo. and Nasruddin has this line where he says, I guess does Tess ask him about hell, and he says, hell is the mistaken sense of separateness. And I didn't sort of I read that the first time through, and but when I was rereading the book this week, I was struck that seemed to have this very powerful connection to what's going on in the birthing room. I don't know if that was something that you were, because she's not separate. Tess, during the birth, Tess is sometimes trying to get a little more separate. Right. But then once the birth has happened, there's a family, and she's not part of it.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, I mean, so there's a whole sequence that Claire's referring to that has to do with ultimately like a theological strain in the book, where there are these three characters mostly that are in different relationships with Islam. And so, yeah, Tess and Abim, her boyfriend, meet a guy living on a houseboat in Cairo who is a Slovene guy who has converted to Islam and is talking ultimately like 12th century theology. And they're responding to this in very different ways. And so as soon as, so he's talking about hell as the delusion of separateness. So, which is burned away. This is which is what hell does. It's an education, right? And so and so
really painful, but
yeah, it's the sting of intimacy. So these guys are very excited about that idea, where Tess is kind of like, oh, as soon as the idea of hell and like you knew that you always belonged there, and she's like, of course I always knew that I belonged in hell, but she doesn't have this kind of, there's no redemption in her worldview. She just sees it as a natural state of affairs that she would burn forever in separateness. And so, yeah, it's something that's going on throughout the book that she's kind of mocking and struggling with at the same time.
Right, but it did, as I say, it seemed to me so striking that, and this leads me to perhaps to the place where I had thought perhaps to begin, which is the birthing room, right? Which is she is having this extraordinary experience, which is to be, it's not quite a birth partner, but and Barish does, the child's father does come and is there, but she has a very intimate and physical and visceral connection to Laura through this tumultuous birth process, and she at a couple of points she literally is like, I gotta leave the room. I've got it. She had like separate. She needs the separateness. So I think it felt to me as though there was something almost spiritual about that experience. I don't know if that was your intention, but it does lead me to ask you also more broadly about how'd you come to be writing from a woman's point of view about childbirth there? How'd that happen?
Yeah. Okay. Well, so that's a story.
Brilliantly, by the way, brilliantly.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that I could say about that, but in the most simple way to put it is that I am married to somebody who was for a couple of years working as a birth doula, and so she would rush off to the hospital at different points in our life and disappear for a couple of days, and then she would come back with all of the madness and euphoria and exhaustion of 48 hours in the hospital. Sometimes it had gone well, sometimes it had gone badly, but one thing that had always happened is everybody had dropped their guard. She had seen people go through this process of losing their defenses. And so it started to seem to me like this perfect frame to really investigate meaning and life and things that are potentially important. And I looked into, you know, Anna Karenina and some of the kind of famous depictions of birth, but I was kind of like, there isn't really like this, using that structure as a kind of framing device hadn't been done, which I found kind of surprising. And then one of Esther, my wife's clients, were very close friends of mine. So I ended up with them, and they insisted that I come with them to the hospital and dragged me into the hospital room. So I went through the birth experience with them. I don't have kids, we don't have kids. So that was my kind of close encounter with birth, where I watched, you know, my friend Christina like turn inside out and give birth to, you know, a beautiful little daughter, Sabina, and who live in Boston. But and so so then this kind of framing mechanism just came to me on a certain morning. I just started writing this scene as these two women are going into the birth, and it seemed clear to me one of them is giving birth and the other one is not giving birth, is kind of misanthropic and pessimistic, and doesn't want kids and doesn't want to be a part of that, and is only there because of friendship. And what that brings out in that relationship seemed like there just seemed to be so many things I could dig into in that scenario, to ask so many questions, really basic questions. And as I went through it, it just kept being more and more kind of interesting to me. Was putting somebody who is like Tess, who's just devastated and pessimistic and heartbroken and has a terrible feeling about humanity, in this situation where she's helping her closest friend give birth, and it's like as you said, it's like a bodily experience. She's pressing on her bones, she's holding her, she's helping her go to the bathroom, she's going through all of that stuff, like body stuff, and which I wanted also to dramatize just how that is, at least in the exposure that I had to it. Each one is its own thing. So yeah, that's.
Well, we actually have, we will have a sort of fuller Q&A time later, but a question that has come in from a member of the audience is what was your experience of writing from the perspective of women? And I'm curious too, I mean, whether that was something that once you embarked on Tess's point of view, that it was easy, or did you have doubts? Did you think, is this, what was your relation to the womanness?
Yeah, well, I mean, doubt is my life, so I'm always in doubt. But so as Claire knows, but I assume others don't, there's another novel in the background of this one, which I had worked on for a long time, where Laura is a super minor character and Tess is, and her brother and sister are kind of the focus of the book, which I had lived with for a couple of years. And so when this scenario appeared to me and I started writing, and it was natural that I would write in a kind of close third person, as the book is. So I'm not first personing, a woman's experience, but I felt like I was going to do my best to write that, and that it was definitely just like the most interesting place to be. And there's a lot of voices that would say, that I of course went through, that were like, this is a bad idea, don't do this, you're not allowed to do this. And somehow that just was like, I'm just going to do it the best I can. And live with it, all of its complexity as best I can, and hope that that will be valuable to other people who read it, and or enjoyable, or whatever it might be. But so it was the most interesting place to be, and the only voices that said don't do it were just not interesting or convincing. They weren't more interesting than the challenge of it, I guess.
I mean, it's interesting to me. You do a wonderful job, but I also think it would have been much harder to say to write Laura's to write close to Laura, right? I think you one of the things that Tess, precisely because temperamentally she has a certain, I mean, she's this very vivid observer, but she has a certain alienation from some of the experience. She doesn't want at this time to be a mother. She doesn't actually so much even at this time want her friend to be a mother. I mean, that I think that there is this distance that makes her makes your creation for very plausible. I think as you know, I'm somebody who believes everybody has to have the right, all artists have to have the right to dare what feels true to them. But we live in a time where increasingly people want to impose rules among about what you can and can't write, and one of them might be like, why do you write from the perspective of somebody of the opposite gender?
I mean, it's also like part of my own experience of gender, so I also am very happy to play with that and blur my own lines and inhabit bodily other experiences or experiences that I have in different ways, and have that be, as much a part of what I can do and be and feel as possible. So
related, I mean, I want to come back to the relation of Tess's interiority to the experience of Laura's childbirth. There's this almost, I don't know if music is the right word, rhythm certainly. I feel that the prose has this very intense, vivid, concrete, sometimes hurtling almost feeling of there's so many, the rush of memories that come, and it's really it's really wonderful. It's also really interesting because I feel as though when I read it, I want to read it again and again. I mean, it's a sort of interesting. It's not a sort of traditional linear narrative in some way, right? And I wondered about the balance of whether it was just intuitive or whether you sort of plotted out. I'm gonna need to come back to the birthing room here. I need, I mean, how did you weave these two threads together?
So the first thing that I wrote was the first scene, and I feel like the whole book was implied somehow, at least to me, in the first 5 pages. And I wrote it very quickly, and there was a time, so at the first 20-30 pages of the book, memory works in a particular way where it's kind of woven in. There's the present and the past are kind of very tightly woven, and then as the book goes, they separate a little bit, and then there are these more like discrete sections, like some of the pages that I read where you're very definitively in memory for pages at a time, and then you drop back into the present of the book, which is the hospital room. And that somehow just happened as I was writing, and I think some of that hurtling that you're talking about was it's not like I was like, okay, I need to get hurtling, but I was like trying to stay with the impetus, and that gave it a kind of velocity and an energy that I wanted to stay true to, which meant that editing it was a terrible experience. Not a terrible experience, but like a very difficult experience, because what I had was like a very, very tightly wound tangle that I wrote very fast. And then I had to spend a couple of years like teasing into a way that somebody else could interact with it. So yeah, this kind of like hermetic quality that a woman's interiority, a woman talking to herself, basically telling herself what
you knew. I feel you knew her story so well. You know,
exactly.
when often in teaching, you know, undergraduate workshops, we talk about Hemingway's Tip of the Iceberg and how you have to really know what's under the water there to, you know, and I feel, you know, this is a case in point where you know so well what's under the water, not least because you've written elsewhere in another novel about these characters and their, you know, what they've done and where they've been and so on, and part of you know, part of what you have really achieved here is to convey so much without it being an 800-page novel, right? But there's we understand the density and complexity of the relations between the different characters, even the ones who are less sort of present in the novel, the quiddity of it. But I can imagine that on first writing, it might have been hard for somebody who didn't already know them.
Right. But I felt like you know, as has been, I don't know, studied, I guess, of generations of how many narratives we absorb now by the age of 10 or whatever, that there's a way of dealing with the complexity of narratives that comes naturally to us, so that I felt like you can put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages into like a smaller, that you can refer and suggest, and people will be with you and they'll understand and they'll just go with you, and the reality of it and the bodily sense of it will be there without having to like write those 800 pages. And so there was an aspect of that was, it wasn't a decision, but I was aware that I was doing that and feeling like that made sense to do that.
Yes.
You know? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that, you know, when we spoke the other day, I was asking a little bit about, which seems to me not unrelated to this. The span of the two women's friendship is in the course of the novel. How old is Laura at the point when she's giving birth? Is she?
She's like 42.
Right. So they've known each other since 25.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a span. It's a long span, and it's quite interesting, because I think to some of your readers like me, the Bosnian War doesn't seem very long ago, but you will have readers to whom it seems in a sort of almost the last century prehistory, like. Right. Back then, wherever, and one of the things that this novel does, one of the many things that it really accomplishes, is to draw a thread, a sort of a thread from that time to this time, so that as readers we understand how they're connected, and it's in part by the characters moving from place to place, from conflict zone to conflict zone, but it isn't just that. It's also about the movement of peoples, right? And about refugees and people without stateless people in different contexts over the course of those essentially 20 years. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little about that aspect.
I mean, so yeah, when we talked the other day, I feel like that there's something that I do think about, that this. So I think today itself is the 25th anniversary of Srebrenica, of the massacre at Srebrenica, the genocidal attack, and which is so one thing. When I moved back, so I went to the Balkans as a 21-year-old in the mid 90s. Like, so I basically came of age in the tail end of the Bosnian War and Kosovo or whatever, and then when I moved back to New York in 2011, I realized that to the kind of 25-year-olds that I met then, it was what a Vietnam vet would have been to me. Right. So, as you were saying, something somewhere, I've heard about it, I know that it happened, but it's almost like sci-fi unreality in some strange way. And as there's been been protests in Belgrade, and there's things happening right now. There's so many things happening right now, but there's been a series of photographs of the ex-Yugoslavia around the time that the war started, and it does seem to me closer to World War II than now, and it does seem so deeply embedded in history. However, it was for me very natural the way that what. So I mean, I watched 9/11 happen from South Serbia where living in a building that was shot up with tomahawks the year before, and so 9/11 was part of global geopolitics. It didn't come from nowhere, and kind of following that thread through the global war on terror to how that changed who came to study Arabic in Cairo, and how the Egyptian, the Cairenes responded to the different kind of Americans that came to study English, up to Tahrir, Gezi, all of these things which the book touches on that have to do with these threads in geopolitics and in that are not unrelated and somehow come together to form a period in history which is now over. And somehow what we were talking about the other day is that somehow what's happening now is an epochal shift, and that the period as kind of weird and lengthy and scattered as it is, that goes from the late 90s in the Balkans to the 2000s in Egypt to the early 2010s or whatever in Turkey, has a kind of coherence. Things are related, and these ways that people move, the kind of statelessness of the neo-colonial aid worker, and the kind of statelessness of populations that are pushed into statelessness by armed conflict, and the relationship between those two kinds are of a piece of that time. And I think it's something interesting to me now to think about this book being very much of that and about that. And it's over somehow.
It's over, but there are still refugees, on the border with Turkey.
Exactly where they were then.
Freezing.
Yeah,
exactly where they were all those years ago. Freezing. They were freezing in the winter, and
right.
It's so. I think that the intensity of that region of the Mediterranean that that of course I had a conversation earlier this summer with an academic who's written a book about the Pan-Arab Syrian Conference of 1920. The book is called How the West Stole Democracy from the Arabs. Okay. And it's a very interesting and revelatory account of this attempt at constitutional democracy by the Syrians.
I think we have some Pan-Arabists in the audience, maybe. So I just want to say hello to any Pan-Arabists we might have in the audience.
In the audience, yeah. But that was again, and then 100 years ago right now was an issue of European involvement and of a sort that prefigured the American involvement that would follow. So it's it all is connected, and as the United States seems to be retreating from the world stage in a certain way right now, I mean, there are a lot of questions about what will ensue. I'm seeing there's another question here that I would like to, from the audience, that I would like to pose to you. I'm curious about your language translation experience. Hang on. I read that you have an earlier novel that wasn't published in English. What language was that earlier book written in? And if not English, was it written in another first language of yours?
Okay. So, no, my first language is English, and the only first language I have. Unfortunately, I didn't start learning other languages until my 20s, and so basically my whole adult life has been mad attempt to learn one language after the other. And sometimes I've gotten good enough to do some translation, but I wrote a book right after the Kosovo conflict, which I never showed to anybody, but a friend of mine I mean, I showed it to a couple of friends, and one of those friends from Belgrade gave it to a novelist friend of hers who translated it and published it in Belgrade. And then that version was translated into Macedonian, and there were some other versions, and there was a bit of it translated into Arabic. And so it had a strange kind of life, but it was never, I don't think any part of it was published in English. And, you know, now if I look back at it, it's like something written by another person. But so, yeah.
What's it about? What's it about? You want to say
it's like, you know, it's like a young person kind of trying to write a punk rock novel about Bosnia and Kosovo at that time. You know, I had been, it's very like autofiction-y, in a way. It's like, when I first got to the former Yugoslavia, I stayed in the former Yugoslav military barracks in Ljubljana, which had been evacuated after independence and then had been occupied by a bunch of anarchists and intellectuals. Like Zizek was there, you know, like it was just it was a strange place full of intellectuals and refugees from Bosnia, and that was kind of my introduction into the former Yugoslavia, which was very particular. And so it kind of starts, you know, it's like it starts from that, but it goes on to talk about different things in the Balkans in a way that I wouldn't write about them now. But there it is. It's done, and it was an incredible experience to have my first work kind of experienced through translation. And so the novelist Vladimir Arsenijević, who's a great Serbian novelist, is who translated it. And so the two of us had this wonderful conversation going, because we would speak to each other in Serbian, and his English is excellent, and write to each other in English, and would have this very kind of wonderful back and forth between these two languages. And there would be times where the characters were speaking broken English, you know, the way that somebody from Bosnia might, and then he's needing to translate that into Bosnian. There are these little riddles that I found really interesting about language. But it was a very good education for me to be an adult struggling with language and understanding what that does to you, what it does to feel people's judgment, who's patient and who's not, who thinks it's cute, who understands what you're going through. And yeah, it was a very formative, so that experience of language has been very formative to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how, this is a little aside, but at this point, because I know you've been recently doing some translation from Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
So how many languages have you got under your belt at this point?
None, zero, nothing.
Nonsense.
No, I mean, no, I like English is my first language. I've done my best to ruin it, but it still stays with me. And like I can get around in Serbian and Spanish. Like I can't get around in Arabic, but I can read Arabic, and I mean, all the stuff that I've translated from Arabic has been, you know, the thing that I just did now is like a really amazing beggars and thieves ode from the 10th century. You know, that it's not going to help me walking around Cairo. I speak some Cairene, you know, Arabic, but I'm not. It breaks my heart, but I'm not as good at it as I should be. And then Turkish, and then there's, you know, French and Portuguese. There's languages I speak badly that at some point I've lived in or something, you know.
But that's a lot of. I mean, does each one get easier? The exposure? Do you pick up a little?
I mean, there's a
more?
way that it helps. I don't know if it's like it helps you to know what you need to know to get started. And then there's certain things like when I moved to Turkey, and Turkish grammar is so different than any European language except Hungarian, which my wife is Hungarian, and I understand Hungarian to a degree. So all of a sudden the grammar made sense to me, so there was a lot of things I didn't have to learn. so in that way it gets easier. I mean, to me, it's just an endless struggle, and joyful, like a wonderful thing. But since I've been in Peru, I've been reading a lot in Spanish, which is great. And,
So what's the next fiction project? Or is there a next fiction? Is it a nonfiction moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, the book that I'm working on now is about the bathysphere dives. So this steel ball that was lowered into the ocean in 1930 in the island of Nonsuch, which is part of the Bermuda archipelago. And so down in the ball, there's a guy crunched up, looking out of these windows at things that nobody has ever seen before, species and effects of light and color. And he's talking into a simple telephone that goes up this steel cable to the boat. And there's a colleague, another scientist named Gloria Hollister, who's there on the deck of the boat, and she's taking notes and asking questions and writing down what he sees. The other scientist, William Beebe. And so I at some point read like this account of Beebe coming up from these dives the first time and being back, like they have to unwinch the steel ball, and he comes back out into the afternoon after, you know, being 3,000 feet below the ocean surface, and he says something to the effect of, "I saw a blue so blue, the yellow of the sun will never be the same," which I found so beautiful. And that this idea of this kind of transformative visionary thing that would happen in that ball. And so this is my next book is writing that story. And I thought of it as a nice creative constraint to keep it in the nonfiction realm. Yeah.
Amazing. I have a question for you from James. James S., who asks, Brad, where in this world did you enjoy the best food? Detailed, appreciated. That is a great question. I want to know too.
Oh my God. Yeah, oh my God, who can compare, you know? I mean, definitely the food in Istanbul is amazing. The food in Mexico City is absolutely amazing. There are certain, you know, pita, cevapi in Sarajevo that don't taste the same anywhere else. You know, there's definitely there's no way to stop. Beirut is, I mean, Aleppo is one of the great food places in the world.
How's the food in northern Peru?
The food in northern Peru is very related to my situation here. So it's basically like the five of us, we're isolated in a kind of gardeny place. The pandemic is quite bad right now. It's one of the worst places in the world, actually. So we're trying to keep it very, very contained. And so we're cooking here, and so it's kind of what the five of us cook. And we've been working with an indigenous curandero who's been teaching us about the traditional medicine of the region, and that requires very distinct dietary restrictions, like no spice, for example, which otherwise is a huge part of my relationship with food. So my interaction with Peruvian food has been very particular, let's say.
Right. We have had a question about Peru. In fact, because just so you know, one of your listeners is from Lima, is tuning in from Lima.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very
nice. Felix Bergel. So is in Lima.
Hello, Lima.
Yeah.
We can answer that last question.
Well, no, the question was, what about Peru, which I asked anyway. So I think Brad has given us a sense that maybe you haven't actually had a very typical Peruvian.
I mean, I think I have had, in a way, very typical Peruvian food, in the sense that I've had a lot of quinoa and legumes, and like just a couple of vegetables. Like I've had a very particular kind of food that's very traditional of here, but I haven't had any of the, like, I would love to go eating in Lima. God knows when that will be possible, and I hope to do that. I can't wait. But yeah.
All right, I think we're out of time, but Claire, Brad, thank you again for your time and this talk. This was really lovely. And Brad, I sort of love the crickets that are going on in the background. I can say that's never happened in a Harvard Bookstore event.
Yeah, I'm sorry about my kind of like noir appearance here. I'm doing the best I can, but
the only thing is we were hoping for some monkeys. You didn't.
Well, the monkeys, yeah, it's hard to see them in the dark, but yeah.
Dark.
Yeah, next time.
One could have jumped on your head.
I know. If only that would happen.
Next time.
Well, for your next book tour, you'll just have to go to somewhere where there'll be monkeys, and then we'll be even.
Hey, I'll just be trapped somewhere else. God knows. But, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for taking the time to have this conversation. And thank you to everyone at home who's tuning in tonight and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. Again, if you would like to support Brad and the bookstore, click the link in the chat to purchase your copy of To Remain Nameless. We appreciate your support now and always. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much to the store and Claire.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Have a good night.